thanks to Dominique and the moderators and his team and everybody that made this conference possible. It's really a gift to all of us. So thank you very much for all of that. So let me tell you a bit about this book. It's a book about people when asked which Orthodox church they are affiliated with. They insist that they are just Orthodox, prosto pravoslavny. I wanted to, sort of curiosity got the cat, I wanted to find out who these people are and how people would come to think of themselves as just Orthodox. I came to understand this group as particularly relevant, especially in a political sense, and I want to speak about that, how they formed, why they're relevant, and what role they might play in certainly religious politics, but politics more broadly going forward. I'll also, because it's such a strong interest of many of you, speak about the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate and what is and perhaps could happen with them in the future. Let's see, I'm sorry, where's our little clicker to advance? That's all right. So I put this up. This is some historical background, which for some of you will be quite well known, but if you don't know this, I just, the essence of it is that thanks to Petro Poroshenko, who made the creation of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine a strong priority of his administration, even one could say his signature accomplishment in office, we had really quite a sea change just 3 years ago when we had the Orthodox Church of Ukraine created. And this very, very much changed the religious landscape in Ukraine. For starters, it set up a new kind of pluralism, if you will, where you now have a very stark choice of church. This was all part of a greater effort to, as they say, securitize and weaponize religion. You know, we refer to religion as being politics by other means, and that is true in spades in Ukraine. And I wanted to begin to flesh out how and why that is possible. I should also say that the stakes are very high. So when, for example, people insist on being prosto pravoslavny, or just Orthodox, and deny allegiance to one church or the other, this has direct ramifications for what was seen as the creation of an independent, entirely autonomous from Moscow church, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, as a parallel effort to shore up Ukrainian state sovereignty and to fortify Ukrainian nationhood on one hand. And on the other hand, what the Russian Orthodox Church goes by in Ukraine, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, was up until fairly recently held about 1/3 of all of the Russian Orthodox Church's parishes. And the recognition and the increasing publicity that that fact began to gain is one of the reasons that Vladimir Putin went on a wild church building spree to try to rectify that balance. But it's important to note that should the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate come out from under the umbrella of the Russian Orthodox Church, this will be a very, very significant loss, not only in terms of the number of parishes, but 3 of the 5 most important monasteries for Eastern Slavs are also in Ukraine. Significant, that would also imply a significant loss of clergy, as well as very active parishioners, and a disproportionately high amount of parishioner donations similarly come from Ukraine. So the losses would be on many, many different levels. And the Ukrainians, of course, have emphasized the fact that should there be a further consolidation of Orthodoxy in Ukraine, arguably the Orthodox Church of Ukraine could overtake in importance, or should overtake in importance, the Russian Orthodox Church for Eastern Christianity. So this is all very, very significant. Complicating either of those scenarios is this very, very large block of people who insist on calling themselves just Orthodox. Some Western scholars have argued that Ukrainians are unprepared for denominational choice, and so as a result, they're undecided, so they insist on being just Orthodox. But of course, the spectrum of choices has changed over time, but as you see in this slide, the number of people who insist that they are just Orthodox remains very, very significant. I'm sorry, this is in Ukrainian, but this is a slide right straight from the Razumkov Center. Those statistics, by the way, are also from Razumkov. This is in asking those who are Orthodox, and about 2/3 of the population in Ukraine claim to be Orthodox. Which Orthodox church do you belong to? You'll see that it wasn't until 2021, and that was November 2021, when there were already very significant Russian forces amassing on the Ukrainian border, that you have then the number of people who proclaim an allegiance to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, that's the first bars, exceeds the number who claim to be just Orthodox. Take it from the same time period, November 2021. This is an all Ukrainian, which Orthodox church do you belong to, not just those who claim to be Orthodox. But you'll still see from the bottom graph, those who don't answer that question for a variety of reasons, it remains very, very significant. So what does all this mean? How does a person become just Orthodox? For starters, I think it's evidence of a certain soft confessionalism in Ukraine. But this translates into religion being a very hard form of soft power in Ukraine. And this then has ramifications, not just within Ukraine, but I would even say throughout the broader Eastern Christian world. So what I want to do now is just very quickly sketch out how a person becomes just Orthodox. What are the ways in which people who might otherwise not be believers, not practice religion, in fact, even be fierce critics of the church and of clergy, nonetheless still claim that they're Orthodox? So in the book, I identify 3 different ways in which this group forms. I argue that in Ukraine and elsewhere in other countries where Eastern Christianity predominates, you have an effective atmosphere of religiosity that infiltrates a person to the extent that, that is to say, private individuals, whereby they come to identify as Orthodox, independent of any of the usual characteristics that one attributes to religiosity. So the 3 here, the religious signs in public space, religious actors in public institutions, and the one that I'll spend the most time on, as I'm a cultural anthropologist, so ethnographic methods match best of all to this last, and I think this is the one that is going to be, over the long run, the most meaningful, given the destruction to public space and public institutions in Ukraine, and that is vernacular religious practices. And by vernacular religious practices, I mean individualized, improvised forms of religiosity, certain either ritualized behaviors or religious practices that, while they trade on a certain established religious symbols, religious rituals, and the like, are nonetheless highly tailored to an individual's needs, wants, desires of the moment, and hence my use of the word vernacular, much like a vernacular religion. So just to quickly go through this, you see this sort of the landscapes, I think, whether one speaks about villages or towns or cities, they're very often defined by those famous gold dome cupolas. Of great interest to me is the very vivid display of religious symbolism in the public space. Perhaps those of you who remember that famous panel that was right on the Maidan for quite some time, Svoboda se nasha religia. That was there, and to the left, you have a residential building in Kiev that has a mural that not only displays the Ten Commandments, but it also has QR codes along the bottom. So in other words, we spoke about cell phones being actors, and in this case, you have literally a building that is instructing on aspects of Christian doctrine. One could even say up to and includes proselytizing. There's other, this is, to the right is Kharkiv metro station that has an enormous icon-like representation of Saint Tatiana. And on the left, it's a shrine to the Virgin Mary, squarely on a public sidewalk in Lviv. So my point being that just tremendous presence of religiosity in public space. This is then complemented by religious actors that are increasingly being integrated into public institutions. This started with the chaplains of the Maidan, who then became military chaplains, as this was then institutionalized. Military chaplains are, that's an old affiche on the bottom to the left-hand side, claiming 600 official chaplains from the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. There are now many more, and there are exponentially more who serve as volunteers. Military chaplains are those that serve in official capacity are employees of the Department of Defense, but the transfer of chaplains of the Maidan into military chaplains also paved the way for chaplaincies of all kinds. So in other words, they divide sort of into either protect, and so you have military chaplains, border guard chaplaincies, and chaplaincies in various transportation hubs. So protect on one side and heal on the other. You've had a tremendous expansion of medical chaplaincies. So now there's chapels that are integrated into hospitals, rehabilitation centers, and other kinds of medical facilities that are used every bit as much by people who work in those facilities as they are by the patients themselves. You also have in universities and prisons and orphanages and the like. And in short, a wide spectrum of chaplaincies have developed in a very, very short period of time. And that is with the aid and assistance of, in particular, the Roman Catholic Church and a broad spectrum of American Protestant groups that have come in with all kinds of models and best practices and other ways in which it has been possible to create these chaplaincies and get them up and running so quickly. And I'll have more to say about these various religious minorities and the role they play in Ukrainian society as we go on. It is nonetheless significant, though, that the chaplaincy sort of is most prominent in the military. And we've been talking about human rights and the like. This also sparked one great debate and, in fact, brought negative in a very significant way, attention to Ukraine, which had been up until this point very much championed for the demonstrated religious tolerance in Ukraine. And I think that is really very much of a post-Soviet success story in Ukraine. However, after 2014 and the military chaplaincy was formed, of course, the question came, should clergy from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate be allowed to be chaplains? And the answer was no. But this, of course, triggered a great many, Amnesty International and all kinds of Human Rights Watch and many, many other groups objected to that kind of decision. They were, I should say, allowed to serve as volunteers, but not in any kind of formal capacity. So let me spend a moment talking about how vernacular religious practices how they have contributed to the just Orthodox and more broadly to religiosity in Ukraine. The most significant aspect of these vernacular religious practices is that they bespeak a certain deinstitutionalization of religion. And this is very significant. What I mean by that is, for example, here you see people placing prayer requests. To the right, it's in that person is in a church, but this will be the only slide that I show you of inside of a church. To the left, it's at a cemetery. These people write prayer requests, which then go to monks, who make then supposedly intercede then and deliver those prayer requests with their learned knowledge and their piety for greater effect. You also have, this is Epiphany. I mean, these things always continue to stun me. Here we are, January 19, and no little cakes with teeny kings inside of them. No, these folks are reenacting the baptism in the River Jordan. The only thing is, in the Middle East, the temperature is quite different. But that doesn't stop people from going on pilgrimage, and pilgrimages very often are connected with some kind of a visit to a sacred spring. This, by the way, was also taken in February. I have my camera with a scarf and gloves and the like, but there they are swimming as well, or bathing, I should say. This is a very common practice, going on pilgrimages, and many people do this. So it's a form of intense religiosity over either a weekend or over a week, but it is a widely practiced form of religion. And it gives way then to things like this. This is a public park in Kharkiv where you have sort of a reenactment of this sort of sacred waters, and then one can bathe in it, and a very visible display of, you know, something of an iconostasis in once again, in public space. And then there's, of course, the ever-present habit of going into a church to light a candle. That's something that's probably familiar to most people in this room. The point I'm trying to make is that there is a wide spectrum of practices that are connected to orthodoxy, that are widely practiced, but not necessarily connected to a specific institution. These practices, I would submit to you, are meaningful, and this is the reason why, of course, everybody paid attention to the whole issue of the Thomas, whether there would be an independent Orthodox Church or not. But that also in part explains the rather low, depending on your perspective, but if you're looking at it coming from certainly the United States, the rather low attendance levels at various Orthodox churches. So why then would someone want to be prosto pravoslavny if you criticize the church and if you know, don't believe this, that, or the next thing? I realize that one of the main benefits to being Orthodox is it begins to articulate a form of relatedness. It situates a person in relationship to other people, in relationship to the place that they live, and it, of course, anchors them in that place. Very often these forms of vernacular religiosity are done on behalf of one's family members or one's friends, and it reaffirms those kinds of bonds. The relatedness aspect is also very clearly delivered these days in what I'm calling the vanishing secularity of history. That is to say, we've also talked a lot over these past few days about narratives, and historical narratives are certainly being rewritten, but religious institutions have the benefit of A, carrying moral authority, B, being able to perform, and once again, very often in a public kind of a setting, certain aspects of a historical experience that begins once again to relate one people to another, a single person to their past. It also begins to, the relatedness aspect of it, we talked about people who are too calm, people who are too funny, but also it creates sort of a, not just a mood, a shared mood, but a civilizational aesthetic. The various ritual calendars, be they weekly or annually, also create common social tempos, people engaging in the same practices, be it fasting or what have you. In short, these practices situate people in terms of fostering a sense of belonging. So what happens once then when you have a war? So I just want to say a few words, if I can. Do I have a moment? About, okay.
Consider it it's a question. Okay. Actually, it was one of the questions.
Okay,
so, yes.
Yeah. So I knew this would be a question, so I just, so why would anyone, be with the Moscow Patriarchate after there's a war? So I think the answer has to be divided between prior to February 24th, 2022, and now. Prior, I think, given the prevalence of what I'm talking about, these vernacular forms of religiosity, the church itself, and specifically the clergy and the leadership, that is to say, even within Ukraine, let alone often Moscow, is almost irrelevant to the religious life such as it is to many people who might go to a Moscow Patriarchate church. I've found overwhelmingly that people might be attached to a particular religious building. Perhaps their parents were involved in renovating it. Perhaps they had their children baptized there. Perhaps it was just the neighborhood church, or it was a particularly beautiful church, a particularly old church. Quite a lot of worth is placed on older buildings, historic buildings. In short, allegiance tends to be to a particular local church. And the practice tends to be of this vernacular form. Therefore, in my experience, not most people, let's put it that way, who go to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate do so for those two reasons, rather than any kind of pronounced loyalty to Russia or think Kirill is a wonderful patriarchate or anything of that nature. So why stay now? Why do we still have these churches? This is a very complicated conversation, but I'll try to make it, I'll give three reasons, three sort of common sense things to do with the Moscow Patriarchate, and explain why they are all very, very difficult to realize, and why that then leads to all kinds of highly creative proposals that are likely to be every bit as difficult too. So the three obvious choices are, of course, the status quo. That's not workable after the full-scale invasion. Reaffiliation, that is to say, to encourage or mandate that those churches that are affiliated with the Moscow Patriarchate transfer over, for a whole variety of legal, bureaucratic, and regulations and rules that Oksana Shevel has written about and that I write about in the book. Reaffiliation, because of understandings of membership and whose church this is, makes any kind of reaffiliation tremendously difficult. By and large, there's, as most people here know, there's no formalized membership. Churches are Ukrainian churches, they serve Ukrainians, and so to begin to dictate who the members are, let alone who has a vote, who doesn't have a vote in terms of determining the affiliation, has proven to be very, very problematic. Reassigning churches in the 1990s, if anybody remembers, that was also extremely difficult. And so reaffiliation, such as it has gone, has been very, very difficult. There's obviously the idea of combining the two churches, folding the churches, combining, unifying, whatever word you want to use. There are a lot of perils and a lot of objections that have been raised to this. On so many different levels, they're very different. Let's start with the clergy, who very often, increasingly, and the longer this war goes on, are ever more demonized for this affiliation with Moscow. And so they anticipate, should the two churches combine, they then would either have a very low status or be subject to hostility or be rendered not relevant. So there's a lot of reservations on the level of the clergy. There are some parishioners who sign on to sort of the, it's the unauthentically and historically official Orthodox Church, the first one that was canonically recognized. That's a small minority, but there are those kinds of rigorous true believers. But I would even say that the majority of parishioners, practice their religiosity in these vernacular ways. And so the will to force any kind of unification is not always there as well. So in short, there's no easy, visible solution as to what to do with the Moscow Patriarchate. It continues to exist in all its 12,000 parishes. Even though I just mentioned 12,000 parishes, I'm not certain the number of parishioners has maintained as robust. It sort of fell, you saw how precipitously it fell after November 2021 while troops were amassed. Now that they're in Ukraine, I think it has really like snow on a hot day. Still, so what about religion, the role of religion going forward? So and this bespeaks my sort of the next research that I'm working on. Religious institutions, they are the second most, after the Army and the volunteers themselves, most trusted institution. And they have, of course, played a key role in terms of delivering humanitarian aid and the like. In short, they retain significant public trust, and the clergy themselves even retain social capital. And so the idea of reckoning with dispossession, and by dispossession I mean not just potential loss of land or loss of infrastructure, but the kind of dispossession that's hardest of all to explain and to live with, what we've spoken earlier about, the shattered familial networks and broken life worlds. I like very much this expression of Oksana, and the disrupted neighborhoods, that kind of dispossession on that level. So I think there will be a need to articulate what are the conditions. We've already been through the process of articulating the conditions as to what constitutes a just war. Now we're going to have to embark on what will constitute a just peace, a fair peace in this sense. And I think then religious organizations will have quite a lot to say on that. They'll play a key role, I believe, in for all of those reasons I just said, and additionally in terms of either fostering, and here I'm speaking not just within, between Ukrainians and Russians, but especially within Ukraine, fostering an atmosphere of reconciliation, or given the pitting of one Orthodox church against another, whether when there's no longer active armed combat, whether we won't have conflicts on a religious level, an acute competition between those churches that could serve to entrench and inflame and aggravate conflicts on a whole other level. So I'm an optimist by nature, so I do want to, so what could guard against that? And this will be my final point, okay? This will be my final point. So what could guard against that? And here I think relying on the pattern of generating tolerance and religious minorities in Ukraine could help. And the interesting thing here is that minorities are truly minorities. Even the largest, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, has only about 9% of the population. Others, when it comes to Protestants, are below 2%, but Muslims and Roman Catholics and the like, Jews, all less than 1%. So minorities are numerically really minorities. Having said that, their impact in terms of policy and even crafting legislation is very, very significant. And that's in part because of the connections they offer to a variety of transnational and global organizations. And just one small point, for example, on the level of providing humanitarian aid. I mean, we see with the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, for example, not just the enormous aid that comes from Caritas, the Roman Catholic organization, but now increasingly, after quite a period of silence when the Pope thought that he could perhaps serve as a mediator in this conflict, now he's come out just the other day, you know, slamming the hurricane of violence, and we all remember his chastising Kirill for being Putin's altar boy and the like. But the Greek Catholic Church, with its connections to the Roman Catholic Church, I already mentioned military chaplains and humanitarian aid, but there are many more, carries on also when one speaks about Protestants, which, you know, I think another really interesting aspect of religious minorities, they might be regionally based or have a base of support in particular regions, Protestants in the East and in the South, Greek Catholics in the West, but they and Muslims and Jews and all consider themselves operating and serving all of Ukraine. And so that's a really, they color regional differences in Ukraine, but they all position themselves as national institutions. So in short, because of the kind of networks they have and the kind of resources.
Just to conclude, maybe. Mm-hmm.
Just to conclude, I think they'll also play a key role in tempering this conflict, or I hope they will at least. Sorry.